Hi, as part of our study of comprehension this week in QAR 705, we are going to look at some different strategies that you can use for promoting comprehension with your students. And one of those strategies is teaching students how to ask questions about what they read. So in this recording, I'm going to talk about some specific strategies that you can utilize with your students to help them learn how to ask good questions in order to improve their comprehension. So the questioning strategies that I'm going to discuss include the directed reading thinking activity, which is commonly called DRTA, reciprocal teaching, SQ3R, and question-answer relationship. But before we begin talking about questioning, I want to talk with you a little bit about a reading strategy called previewing, because previewing is actually a step within some of these other strategies that I'm going to be teaching you. So when we preview a text, we look at the text in advance to figure out what it's going to be about, because that helps us activate our background knowledge and it gives us a sense of where the text is going. So that helps us as we begin to read the text. So to preview a text, a student should do the following things. They should be looking at the title of the text as well as the subtitle. It's also helpful for students to look at the copyright date of the text to see how current the material is. It helps them determine whether it's something new or something that might be out of date. Also, students should read the introduction so they understand the main ideas, and this is especially applicable to textbooks. Oftentimes a textbook is going to be organized in a fashion so that there's some kind of introductory statement at the very beginning to give readers an understanding of what the chapter of the textbook is going to cover. Another good technique to utilize when you're previewing a text is to look at the headings and the subheadings so you have an understanding about what the text is about. And I feel like that's really important during this previewing process, because that will really help you understand how the text is organized. It'll also show you what topics the author of the textbook chapter is going to address. And it's also recommended that if you're using a textbook for previewing, that you look at the end of a chapter and read the summary, because the summary is going to include an overall statement about the topic. So if you read the summary as one of your first steps, you'll get a good understanding of the gist of the text overall. And something that I do, if I know that I have to read a chapter in a textbook, or if I have to read a journal article and I think that it might be challenging for me, something that I do is I actually go through all these steps of previewing the day before I read the text, because for some reason it just, looking at it the day before kind of helps the information sink in. So I feel like when I sit down the next day to actually read the text or read the chapter, that I already have a good understanding of what it's going to be about. So for me, that's just a trick I use, and that may not work for other people, but I find it really helpful. So something to think about when you read, either for your graduate classes or as something you teach your students to do as they read text in your class. So I really like acronyms and specific strategies. So one technique for previewing a text that you can teach with your students is called THIEVES. So with THIEVES, you teach the students to do the following. First, they read the title of the text, whether it's a book or a chapter. Then you have them look at the headings. Then you have them read the introduction. Then you have them read the first sentence of every paragraph, because as you know, the way that many texts are organized, especially with a textbook used in school, oftentimes the first sentence will include the main idea of the paragraph. So reading the first sentence in every paragraph will help you get a sense of some of the key ideas that are going to be introduced in the text. Then you have students look at visuals, things like photographs, as well as diagrams and timelines and maps. And you also have students look at vocabulary. And oftentimes if you're having students preview a textbook, key vocabulary is going to be emphasized in some way. For example, sometimes it's in italic font, or sometimes it's in a bold font. So you can have students look at those key terms that are emphasized in the text so they can have a good understanding of what the text will be about and what are some of the important ideas that will be communicated in the text. Then you have students read end of chapter questions if those are available, because those end of chapter questions are going to be asking students about important ideas. So if you read them ahead of time, then you're able to read the text in a more purposeful way. And then finally, you have students read the summary of the text as part of the previewing. So if you like this acronym THIEVES, it might be something you might want to put up in your classroom as a poster, or something you might want to have students write down in their notebooks. So now I'm going to move into talking about specific strategies that involve students questioning the text, and I'm going to start with the directed reading thinking activity. And this particular strategy is designed for helping students learn how to read for a particular purpose. And they set their own purpose for reading because they are ultimately writing questions that give them a purpose for reading. And it's especially useful because it utilizes small segments of a text. Like, you don't want to do the DRTA strategy using like a whole textbook chapter. You might just want to take a chunk of, say, a textbook chapter. Like, you might, just select, all the paragraphs that fall under a particular heading or subheading within the text. So again, you don't want to use something really long. And there are 5 steps involved with DRTA, and I'm going to explain those in more detail on the next slides. So the first step of DRTA is previewing, and like I mentioned before, students are looking at the chapter title, any subtitles or subheadings, the introduction, and so forth. And of course, not all books are going to have these particular features, but a lot of textbooks that are used in school, as well as a lot of informational books that children read, will have a lot of these features. And as I talk about DRTA, I'm going to talk about it in the context of the book Neighborhood Sharks by Catherine Roy. And that's an informational book about white sharks that migrate to the coast of California in September every year. And this particular book won a Cybert honor in 2015, so it's a fairly recently published book that received some positive recognition from the American Library Association. So if I was reading this text for the first time, I would be looking at a lot of these features. For example, the book is well organized. Every page spread, meaning the left and right page placed together, has a heading at the top, so I would be looking at those headings to get a sense of where the text is going. And I would also look at the many illustrations, because that would give me an idea of some of the topics that the author is going to address. The second step of DRTA is to make decisions, so students think about what they already know about the topic and what they still need to learn about the topic. So if I was reading Neighborhood Sharks, and I'm going to go back to the slide for a second, and I was reading the page spread entitled The Perfect Body, which you see on the left side of this slide, I would think about, what do I already know about a shark's body? Well, I know that sharks swim in the ocean and they have fins, and the fins help them swim, but I don't really know the different kinds of fins, and I don't know their names, and I don't know each fin's specific function. So that's information that I don't have that I could possibly learn by reading this text. So the next step of the DRTA is writing. So in this phase, students write questions about what they still need to know about the topic. So as I mentioned a moment ago, I said that I don't really know much about the different functions of a shark's fins, so I'm going to write questions that are related to that topic. For example, I might ask questions like, what are names of the different kinds of fins that a shark has? What are the purposes for the different kinds of fins? And I might also ask, why is a shark's body like an airplane? And you might think that's a funny question, but if you can see this image on this slide, the author actually has an illustration of a shark being depicted like an airplane in order to compare the way that a shark lifts its body in the water to the way that an airplane lifts its body into the air. So if I hadn't read the text already, that might be a question I have, like, why would the author do that? But I mean, I have read the text, so I do know why she does that. But if this was new to me, that might be a question that I have. In the next phase, students actually read the text, and they read the text with their questions in mind. For example, if I was reading the selection called The Perfect Body, I would want to pay special attention to the different kinds of fins that sharks have and what are the purposes of the different kinds of fins that sharks have, because those are my questions. That's what I want to know. That's what I want to gain from reading this particular text selection. So I'm going to be reading with those questions in the back of my mind. So I'm reading with a purpose. That's really one of the keys about doing DRTA, is answering my own questions that I already determined. So then our final phase of DRTA is to reflect. So students determine the answers to their questions by locating supporting evidence from the text itself. So it teaches them to go back into the text, thinking about their questions and finding the answers. And sometimes students might find that the text doesn't answer the questions they have, so then students decide, well, what do I still want to know about the topic, and where can I find more information about this topic in order to answer my question? So when I did the DRTA with the shark book, one of my questions was, what are the purposes for the different kinds of fins? And I actually found that information directly stated in the text. I learned that the keels and the dorsal fin make the shark's body stable, and the pectoral fins help the shark in the water. So now I'm going to talk about the strategy called reciprocal teaching, and this strategy involves some modeling on the part of the teacher. It also involves having students summarize what they've read, and it also involves asking and answering questions. So it's a good technique to use with all readers, and it's especially helpful for struggling readers because it only involves using a small chunk of the text at one time. So it's a good strategy for those students in particular. So these are the steps of reciprocal teaching. First, the teacher assigns the student a paragraph to read. Then when the student is done reading the paragraph, and of course the teacher should also have read the paragraph too, the teacher summarizes the paragraph, noting some of the key points and maybe a few important supporting details. Then the teacher asks the students questions about the paragraph, and the student responds to those questions. And if the student's responses show any misunderstandings about what was read, the teacher clarifies those misunderstandings. But that may not always happen, so that part may not always be necessary. Then the student makes some written predictions about what he or she thinks is going to happen in the next paragraph of the text. So that way when the student reads the next paragraph, the student is reading with a purpose in mind to see whether his or her predictions are in fact correct. And then in the next step of reciprocal teaching, the student and the teacher actually switch roles. So the student becomes the one summarizing the text, and the student becomes the one who is asking the questions of the teacher. So it puts the student in the driver's seat with this particular activity. However, it's already been modeled by the teacher, so the student has a good understanding of what's expected with reciprocal teaching. And, reciprocal teaching is often discussed as a whole class activity, but it could also work in small groups or one-on-one with a teacher and a student. So, of course, as a teacher, you have to use your professional judgment and be flexible. So, use this strategy and the other strategies that I'm discussing in the way that works well for you and your students. So SQ3R is another strategy, and this is also not only a strategy that helps students answer questions and ask questions about a text, but it's also a good technique for teaching students how to study for tests and other quizzes, things like that in the school setting. So SQ3R starts off by having students survey major ideas that are included in the text, and when we survey the major ideas, we utilize those previewing strategies that we talked about at the very beginning. We might use some of the techniques listed in THIEVES, such as reading the chapter summary and looking at visuals and so forth. So that's what we mean by survey the major ideas. Then with the text selection, we look at headings and subheadings, and we turn these headings into questions. For example, if you are reading a science textbook and it is about different animal habitats, and you have a heading that says habitats of turtles, you might turn that heading into a question like, what sort of habitat does a turtle live in? Something along those lines. So every heading then becomes a question. Then what students do with SQ3R is they read the text itself in order to answer the questions. So as they read, they might write their questions down and locate where they found the information in the text. So after students have finished reading the text and answering the questions that they wrote, they recite the material. They look away from the notes that they made, and they try to remember as much as they can. They try to repeat what they learned in their own words. They're rehearsing the information so that it becomes stored in their memory. And then finally, the last phase of SQ3R is review. Students study the notes that they made, the questions they wrote, and the answers they wrote, and try to remember it so that they remember that information for its own sake, but also to help them study for a test or some other sort of assessment. And the last strategy I'm going to talk about in this recording is question-answer relationship, which is commonly called QAR. And QAR helps promote higher order thinking about what students read. It also helps students write their own questions about a text. And it also gives teachers and students a common vocabulary for discussing what they think about a text. And this in turn gives students a greater understanding of the processes involved with comprehending a text. And that might sound pretty abstract, but I think you'll have a good understanding by the time I talk about QAR in some detail now. So one important principle of QAR is that there are two main sources for constructing your understanding or for constructing meaning about a text. One source is information that's stated explicitly in the book. And you can find that information by doing things like skimming, scanning, and rereading the text. And another source for constructing meaning from the text is in your head. So the information actually comes from your experiences and your background knowledge, not from the text itself. So with QAR, there are 4 different types of questions subdivided into in the book questions and in my head questions. So in the book questions include write there questions and think and search questions. With write there questions, the answer is located right there in the text. It's really easy to find. But with think and search questions, the answer is found in the text itself. You don't have to use any of your prior knowledge to answer the question, but the information you need to answer the question might appear in multiple paragraphs or multiple chapters. So you might need to look in multiple places within the text in order to answer a think and search question. Now moving on to in my head questions, author and me questions, with those kinds of questions, the answer is not in the text. You need to think as a reader about what the text is saying, and you also have to integrate your background knowledge with what the text is saying in order to answer the question. And then with on my own questions, the answer is not in the text at all. As a reader, you have to rely upon what you know, your opinions, your ideas, your experiences in order to answer the question. So as a teacher, having this vocabulary that's utilized in QAR is really helpful, because if students are struggling to answer a particular question, it might be because, say that students are trying to answer an on my own question and they're looking for the answer in the text. That's not really fruitful, is it? So as a teacher, you might instruct students, well, that's an on my own question, so how could you figure out the answer to that question? And then students would realize, oh, that's right, on my own questions, I have to think about it. The author's not telling me the answer. That's in my head. So having that common vocabulary is really useful. So as a teacher, you want to teach students about these particular question types and give them examples. And then you can also have students write these questions about texts that they're reading, so they can not only answer them, but they also know how to write these questions. So that way they can give themselves their own purposes for reading by having a set of questions to answer. So here are some examples of QAR questions so that you have a more concrete understanding of the types. For example, a right there question would be a question like, where was Claudette Colvin born? And I'm taking these questions away from a book that I teach in one of my undergraduate courses called Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice by Philip Hoos. So I can find the answer to that right there question, I think on the first page of the book. It says it right there in the first or second paragraph. So as my think and search question, I have, what impact did Jim Crow laws have on African American people in Montgomery? Well, that's a think and search question because the author talks a lot about Jim Crow laws, and that information is scattered over multiple paragraphs in the first or second chapter. So to answer that question, you would need to be reading, from multiple places in order to answer the question. It's not just like in one spot. You have to really look for it. in several areas. An author in me question is a question, again, that requires you to think about what the text says, and it requires you to make some inferences. So my example is, why do you think the saleswoman refused to let Claudette have the Easter hat that she wanted? In the book, Claudette Colvin wants to buy this Easter hat that she really admires, and the saleswoman doesn't let her try it on. She keeps bringing her different hats. And you have to use your background knowledge to figure out why the saleswoman is behaving in this way. So since this book is set during the Civil Rights era, and at that particular time, Claudette was a young girl living in Alabama, so you can probably infer that the saleswoman, who is white, probably had some prejudice against Claudette, and that's why she didn't want to sell her the Easter hat that Claudette really wanted. At least that's my interpretation of it. But you see, I have to bring in my background knowledge about that time period in order to answer the question. And then with an on my own question I have, what do you think was the author's purpose for telling readers about Claudette Colvin's childhood in Chapter 2? So the author never says, I'm telling you about Claudette Colvin's childhood because A, B, and C. That doesn't happen in the book at all. You have to think as the reader, well, why would the author tell me this? How is this information important to what I think will happen in the rest of the book? So you really just have to think about it in your head and not utilize the text to answer an on my own question. So teaching students about these different question types with QAR is a really helpful way to get them comprehending what they read. So we will have some other videos for you to watch this week about different comprehension strategies, but those are just some strategies that you might utilize to get students involved with questioning. And if you need any more details about these or have further questions about them, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.